Oi, bom dia. Bom dia, Felipe. Tudo bom?
Tudo bem.
Estou sabendo que houve um apartheid ontem.
Mas hoje vai ser um dia de união, né? Esse frio acolhedor que nos une hoje aqui em São Paulo. Hoje à noite vai ser mais, né, de
Calorosa,
união.
junta.
Exatamente.
Conselho unido, né, gente?
Exatamente.
Né, Edgar? Edgar ficou na missão, né? A gente está aguardando ansiosamente as orientações e indicações do encontro de hoje à noite.
Momento cultural, né?
Momento cultural, de compartilhamento de outros tipos de experiências, né, relacionadas mais à vida das pessoas.
Exatamente.
Pessoal, bom dia. Bom dia a todas as pessoas presentes. Agora a gente vai fazer aquela, né? Pessoal, bom dia. Esse grupo aqui, ó, a gente vai fazer grupo da esquerda, do meio e da direita. Da esquerda, com certeza, já da minha esquerda aqui deu um show, né? Bom dia. Sejam bem-vindos e bem-vindas ao nosso segundo dia de encontro, né? Da 7ª Semana Internacional de Esporte pela Mudança Social, que é um evento incrível, com pessoas incríveis e com falas que hoje também vão ser muito maravilhosas, né? Meu nome é Ader Lúcia, mas pode chamar de AD, né? Mais fácil. Eu sou lá de Quixelô, no interior do Ceará. Como eu já falei ontem, eu falo sempre, né? Faço parte do Conselho Deliberativo da REMS, Rede Esporte pela Mudança Social, REMS. Represento os companheiros das Américas, né? Para relembrar, esse evento é organizado pela REMS, que conta com o apoio da Nike, da B3 Social, do Instituto Açaí e do PNUD, né, que é o Programa das Nações Unidas para o Desenvolvimento.
Bom, eu sou Felipe, eu sou também do Conselho de Representantes, sou da Fundação Gol de Letra, e a gente tem um recado para dar a vocês de um ajuste na programação hoje da tarde. Nós, hoje à tarde, teríamos uma oficina prática conduzida pela URES, para esporte, atividade física e pessoas com deficiência. Em função de alguns ajustes, essa oficina ela foi transferida para amanhã, tá? Às 16h30, na quadra externa número 4. Então, hoje à tarde, nós vamos nos concentrar aqui na atividade de relato de experiências, que vai ser conduzida pelo Adeilton Sene, da Associação Desportiva para Deficientes, e pelo René Fender, do SESC São Paulo. Então, no horário das 4h30, onde nós nos dividiríamos, vamos nos manter aqui para essa atividade do relato, ok? E aí, amanhã, a gente retoma a atividade prática na quadra externa número 4, ok? Aí, então, além dos nossos parceiros, que a Derlúcia citou, a quem direcionamos nossos agradecimentos, também gostaríamos de agradecer novamente no dia de hoje a Escola de Arte, Ciência e Humanidade da Universidade de São Paulo, que é anfitriã do evento nessa edição.
E para quem ainda não conhece a nossa rede, reunimos hoje 127 organizações que atuam com o esporte pela mudança social, espalhadas em todo o Brasil. A missão da REMS é mobilizar e fortalecer estas organizações e o setor do esporte para o desenvolvimento, com o propósito de contribuir para que todas as pessoas tenham acesso ao esporte e às atividades físicas. Já fica aqui o convite, se você ainda não é membro REMS, é só ir lá no nosso site, né, sugestão, coloca lá no Google REMS, aparece, né, a nossa página, vocês clicam e tem lá um link para vocês se inscreverem. Se vocês trabalham com projetos sociais com foco no esporte, fica aqui o nosso convite, a gente ficará muito feliz em receber as inscrições de vocês para ser membro, né, para se candidatar a ser membro REMS. Felipe aqui é membro fundador desde 2007, 2006, muito tempo atrás.
É isso aí. Bom, então, para a gente começar o nosso bate-papo agora da manhã, nós convidamos ao palco para falar um pouco sobre o esporte e mudança social. E, nesse momento, chamamos de Narrativas que Movem a Neide Santos. Neide, por favor. Pessoal, embora a Neide dispense apresentações, né, porque ela é uma lenda hoje no nosso meio, vale falar um pouquinho sobre ela. Ela é baiana, radicada em São Paulo desde 67, moradora do Capão Redondo, periferia da Zona Sul aqui da capital, Trabalhava de dia em uma oficina de costura, estudava à noite e os fins de semana corria pelas ruas da comunidade. A rotina de treinamentos virou inspiração para outras mulheres que pediram para correr com ela. Atualmente, Neide se dedica em tempo integral e de forma voluntária ao projeto Vida, Corrida, associado da REMS, em busca da transformação social por meio do esporte e de uma comunidade. Então, Neide, o microfone, o palco são seus.
Bom dia. Oh, gostei do bom dia. Gente, a maioria são pessoas que eu conheço e tem algumas carinhas novas, gente novas, adoro gente jovem, né? E vamos lá. Eu sou uma sonhadora e uma das maiores campanhas que Nike fez comigo foi: não mude seus sonhos, mude o mundo. Vai de como cada um interpreta o que é sonhos. Eu parei de falar com sonhos para pessoas que não sabem sonhar. Eu parei de olhar em olhos que não brilham como os meus. Sabe por quê? Ofende? Eu gosto de falar com o sonhador, porque quando eu falo com o sonhador uma coisa louca, ele vem com duas maiores ainda. E eu, sinceramente, sou uma mulher que sou movida a sonhos. Eu sonho dormindo e sonho acordada. E todos os dias eu trabalho para realizar esses sonhos. Esses sonhos começam com uma menina de 6 anos que queria ser criança, que queria ter direito de ir para a escola, direito de brincar, de se divertir, mas esses direitos me foram negados e eu não imaginaria que esses direitos fossem prolongar tantos anos de minha vida. Ao ser entregue para uma adoção, eu fui parar numa oficina de costura, vim para o Brás, saí do meu paraíso, Porto Seguro, e vim para a região do Brás. E lá eu vivi até chegar à minha adolescência, sem nenhum contato com nenhuma criança. Quando eu ouvia algum barulho, eu ficava agitada, eu queria muito, muito, muito estar com outras crianças. E aí eu começava a sonhar, porque eu queria estar com minha família, eu queria ter meus irmãos por perto. E aí um belo dia, eu falo um belo dia porque foi o dia em que eu me sentia mais feliz, foi quando o poder público entrou nesse local e me tirou de lá. E me levou para uma família de tutores, né, que iam ficar comigo até encontrar minha família biológica. E aí eu fui para a escola. Gente, foi a maior felicidade da minha vida ir para a escola, porque mesmo já com 12 anos, com crianças de 7 anos, eu estava muito, muito, muito feliz, porque eu estava convivendo com crianças. E eu era tão pequenininha, tão raquítica, que eles me confundiam e pararam de perguntar a minha idade. E, como muito inteligente, eu comecei a pular de séries, né? Em pouco tempo, né, eu já estava lendo, e a leitura foi incrível na minha vida, porque a leitura me levou para o mundo. E aí um professor de matemática dava aula de educação física e me apresentou atividade física e me apresentou vários jogos. Como foi dito ontem, né, na escola tinha queimada, tinha handebol e tinha vôlei. E eu adorava jogos coletivos. Eu já dava tudo que era coletivo, porque sempre tinha alguém por perto de mim. E aí tinha os campeonatos colegiais. Eu fui para esse campeonato, fui jogar handebol e faltou uma menina no revezamento 4x100. O professor chega lá na quadra e me tira dessa quadra e me dá me faz um grande desafio, você vai correr 100 metros. E aí eu questionei ele e falou, tudo bem, vai correr 100 metros, você é tão leve que qualquer coisa o vento leva. Põe seu bracinho para trás, pega aquele bastão e corre o mais rápido possível. E aquele dia eu corri 100 metros e eu ganhei uma medalha. Sabe aquela medalhinha de honrar o mérito? Foi incrível. Não existia a palavra empoderar, mas aquela medalha me empoderou. Porque eu comecei a acreditar. E o professor ainda falou para mim que eu poderia treinar e poderia ser uma medalhista olímpica. E quem não acredita no professor? Né? E eu acreditei no professor. E eu comecei a treinar. E ia nas competições, parei de jogar handebol. Em 1974, gente, faz exatamente 51 anos. 51 anos que eu comecei a correr. E a corrida, ela era libertadora para mim, porque quando eu estava correndo, era como se eu tivesse entrado em outra dimensão. Eu esquecia de todas as mazelas, eu esquecia de todas as coisas ruins. E aí, tive a oportunidade de fazer um teste, ir para um centro olímpico para treinar para ser uma atleta olímpica. E aí a felicidade foi maior ainda. Só que coisas boas também aconteceram nesse tempo. Minha mãe biológica apareceu. E aí não era só eu, eram 6 irmãos. E eu, como mulher, eu fui ser a mãe dos meus irmãos. Eu parei de estudar, eu parei de treinar e fui ser dona de casa. Mas, em 1975, as mulheres conquistaram o direito de correr a São Silvestre. E eu falei, já que eu não vou ser uma medalhista olímpica, já que eu não vou treinar mais para a competição, eu vou correr na rua. E eu fui correr na rua. E foi uma década incrível para mulheres. Foi a década que nós conquistamos o direito de jogar futebol, de correr corridas longas que os homens faziam, e também a década em que as mulheres conquistaram o direito de competir nas Olimpíadas, a maratona olímpica. Eu só vou pular um pouquinho disso aqui, dessa história que eu vou te contar. E a primeira mulher que correu uma maratona olímpica oficialmente foi a Joan. Eu não sei pronunciar o sobrenome dela, esqueci agora. E aí, há 15 dias atrás, eu estava em Los Angeles, andando pela rua. Daí a pouco, eu vejo uma mulher pequenininha como eu, com o corpo um pouco avançado, correndo. E aí eu peguei o Bruno, olha quem estava ali, a primeira mulher que correu uma Olimpíada. Ele falou, não, é ela sim. Aí o Bruno gritou, João! E aí ela parou. Gente, essa mulher parou e veio conversar comigo. Consegui tirar uma foto com ela e 2 dias depois eu estava no mesmo lugar com ela, correndo uma meia maratona. Essa maratona, essa mulher olímpica, ela fez os 21 quilômetros, né? Nós somos idosas hoje, né? Ela fez para 2 horas e eu fiz para 2:10. Cheguei 1 minuto depois dela e foi incrível. E eu quero compartilhar aqui com vocês a minha medalha, porque medalhas são coisas simbólicas. Essa foi a minha medalha, uma joia. Recebemos uma medalha, todas as 18.000 mulheres recebeu uma joia de presente. Foi um momento incrível. E aí não teve como lembrar daquela menina lá de 14 anos que queria ser uma medalhista olímpica. E eu estava correndo ao lado da primeira mulher que correu uma maratona olímpica. E aí tudo bem. E aí, quando chega essa fase da minha vida, que eu fui ser a mãe dos meus irmãos, eu, como qualquer menina, mesmo com tudo que eu tinha passado na adolescência, eu sonhava com meu príncipe encantado, como qualquer adolescente. Só que meu príncipe encantado, ele não tinha um castelo, ele não tinha olhos azuis, ele não tinha um cavalo branco. Meu príncipe encantado, ele era negro, morava num barraco de favela, mas tinha uma bicicleta e gostava de jogar futebol. E gostava de correr comigo. E eu me apaixonei. E dessa relação, eu tive meu tão sonhado filho, meu primogênito. E aí, vivemos intensamente felizes por pouco tempo. Numa ditadura militar, ele foi assassinado pelo simples fato de ser negro. Me vi, aos 19 anos, viúva e com um filho para criar. Muito difícil, criei meu filho. Tempos depois casei, tive 2 filhos e me dividindo, acordando às madrugadas, saía para treinar, para ir para as corridas. Nas corridas sempre ganhava alguma coisa, um dinheirinho que ajudava nos afazeres de casa, e assim seguiu a minha vida. E aí, né, na década de 90, eu correndo a São Silvestre, eu apareço em rede nacional, e o jornalista dizendo que eu era a única mulher de um bairro de mais de 200 mil pessoas correndo uma São Silvestre. Uma mulher de 60 anos, Maria Gonçalves, ela é de 1937, ela quis correr comigo. Pouco tempo depois, várias mulheres da comunidade começaram a acordar de madrugada para ir para uma prática esportiva. Era uma época que na comunidade não existia SELS, não existia SESC, não existia nenhuma política pública que atendesse mulher. Mulher, eu falo, a partir dos 16 anos. Só tinha as políticas públicas que atendessem a criança e quando a gente tivesse velho capengando, que não aguentava mais nada, aí tinha política pública. Mas essa idade era ociosa, não tinha absolutamente nada para essas mulheres. E aí, meu filho Mark, como qualquer menino, era apaixonado por futebol, e a gente tinha um grande zagueiro da seleção brasileira, Márcio Santos. E ele queria ser um Márcio Santos. E meu filho começou a jogar futebol. Ele começou a jogar futebol, foi jogar em segunda divisão, e aí me pediram para eu adulterar a idade do meu filho para ele jogar com os adultos. Eu não aceitei, meu filho se revoltou comigo, mas eu sabia que era errado e eu não poderia fazer isso. Seguimos nossas vidas trabalhando. E aí meu filho queria muito que eu atendesse as crianças da comunidade. Era uma época que o crack estava chegando nas periferias. E ele via porque as crianças da comunidade eles só faziam entregas. Essas crianças não usavam. Pediam para alguém, davam um trocadinho, eles lá entregavam e voltavam, porque também não tinha creches. Nós tínhamos que atravessar a ponte, trabalhar, cuidar dos filhos dos outros, e nossos filhos ficavam lá no bairro. Enquanto eles estavam na escola, depois da escola não tinha mais o que fazer. E o meu filho, o meu primogênito, me impedia para que eu atendesse as crianças da comunidade. Infelizmente, eu não podia fazer isso, porque eu também trabalhava. E aquelas mulheres acordavam de madrugada para treinar comigo. Que hora que eu ia atender essas crianças? E aí, um dia, eu lembro que era um feriado, 7 de setembro, o meu filho saiu de casa e meu filho não voltou. Não aconteceu o ciclo natural da vida. Eu enterro o meu filho. E foi uma revolta gigantesca. Eu sou uma mulher de fé, eu sou uma mulher católica, praticante. Confesso para vocês que eu briguei com Deus e o mundo. Eu não entendia até quando tudo de ruim ia acontecer na minha vida. Os momentos felizes da minha vida era poucos. Eu sonhava que eu ia ter aquela família perfeita, que tudo ia dar certo, que a gente iria construir uma vida juntos, mas essas coisas assim era sempre atropelada por alguma coisa que me destruía. Só que eu tinha uma corrida e tinha um batalhão de mulheres que não desistiram de mim. Essas mulheres todos os dias iam na minha porta e batiam e gritavam, vamos treinar. Eu falava, amanhã eu vou. E aí um dia essas mulheres se juntaram, viu que eu já estava numa depressão, e nem eu sabia que eu estava numa depressão, foram para a minha casa, e aí me deram uma ideia. Faça a vontade do Mark, comece a atender as crianças. E eu falei, como? Que hora? Vamos aí final de semana. E eu comecei a atender as crianças, sábados, domingos e feriados, na minha rua, na frente da minha casa, que também era uma rua que tinha o estigma de ser a Rua da Morte, porque era uma cidade, era um bairro dormitório. E à noite sempre acontecia alguma coisa na rua e uma mulher foi assassinada lá. E eles denominaram a minha rua como Rua da Morte. Só que a minha rua é a rua mais reta. Eu moro em Tapsirica da Serra. A partir do momento que na estrada de Tapsirica da Serra, a partir do momento que você chega no centro empresarial, na Giovanni Gronchi, você sobe e desce, vai descendo até chegar em Tapsirica. E os bairros lá é tudo. Tanto que lá não tem muito, as pessoas não pedalam muito, porque lá é muito morro. Lá é muitas subidas e descidas. Quem conhece o território sabe como é. E aí eu começo a atender as crianças da comunidade e começo a crescer. E aí chegou uma hora que eu falei assim, e agora, o que eu vou fazer? O que eu faço? E aí eu chego no meu trabalho e peço para as pessoas que eu prestava o serviço que eu queria chegar mais tarde porque eu precisava treinar essas crianças que não fosse somente no sábado. E ela me propôs, você pode chegar mais tarde, só que seu salário vai ficar menos. Eu tomei uma decisão sem nem fazer cálculo. Aceitei e fui fazer isso. Imagine, eu sou pobre, né? Pobre financeiramente, mas rica em espírito. Eu moro numa casa de moradia popular, né? Até hoje, moro no mesmo lugar. E quando fala que vai diminuir seu salário, ainda você aceita isso. Tem que ser muito louca e muito sonhadora. E aí foi. E aí se passaram, gente, 10 anos acreditando que isso um dia dá certo, que alguém um dia iria nos ver. E aí eu ia na Lan House, enviava e-mail para todas as marcas esportivas que trabalhavam no Brasil. Me diziam não e outras nem me respondiam. Eu não vivia o mundo lá fora, eu não conhecia outras organizações, eu só conhecia o meu trabalho e meu território, e eu fiquei lá. E aí, 10 anos se passaram, em 2009, eu tive a oportunidade de ir assistir uma palestra, e a palestra estava falando sobre mulheres virando o jogo no esporte. Era da Choca, né, uma ONG internacional, que foi dar uma palestra, e eles mostraram várias pessoas fazendo esportes no mundo inteiro e de uma forma muito precária, como eu fazia no bairro do Capão Redondo. No final, a Júlia Furlani, ela perguntou se alguém conhecia algum projeto semelhante, que fazia alguma coisa semelhante. E eu falo, aquele dia, Mark levantou minha mão. Porque eu nunca tinha falado em público, eu nunca tinha falado para outras pessoas que não fosse a minha comunidade, o meu território. E aquele dia eu falei com tanta propriedade. Eu falei assim, eu faço tudo isso e mais um pouco. E aí ela pediu para que eu falasse o que eu fazia no Capão. E aí eu falei. E aí me pediram para escrever no edital, eu escrevi nesse edital, eu vou ser breve porque eu tenho que respeitar o meu tempo. E aí, quando eu escrevi nesse edital, quando deu bem-sucedido, tinha pessoas incríveis, The Best, ONGs já que estavam fazendo trabalhos incríveis, reconhecida, com patrocínio e tudo, né? E já tinha chegado a lei de incentivo, né? E essas outras trabalhavam com lei de incentivo, e eu era a maluquinha que corre, a mulher do Capão Redondo, que tinha um projetinho no Capão Redondo, a analfabeta, que não conseguia escrever uma assinatura, escrevia seu nome por extenso. Mas, assim, ainda bem que eu sempre sofri demência. Eu nunca liguei muito porque as pessoas falavam de mim. Eu era maluquinha mesmo. E um coração tão generoso que, quando me faziam uma crítica ou alguma coisa, aquilo só me motivava a continuar. Eu falei assim, pô, ninguém atira pedra em árvore que está dando fruto, né? E vamos lá. E aí, meses depois, me ligam e falam, abriu o e-mail, eu falei assim, não, eu tenho que chegar do trabalho, eu tenho que ir na lan house, porque a gente não tem computador. E aí, gente, cheguei do trabalho rapidinho, e aí fui abrir o e-mail. E aí nós fomos eleitos, Projeto, nós ganhamos o prêmio Game Changers, Mulheres Virando o Jogo no Esporte. E quem financiou esse edital era a Nike. E aí a Nike faz uma festa para a gente e vai lá e nos entrega um cheque de R$5.000. Foi a maior festa para quem nunca tinha ganhado um centavo. Gente, mas isso era em 2009, viu? 2009, aí, a primeira coisa que eu fiz foi comprar um computador. Nem pensei em material esportivo, porque não conseguia mais fazer planilha em papel, as pessoas pediam o telefone, pegar, até tinha vez assim de pegar o saquinho de papel, de pão, escrever o telefone para dar para alguém, para poder entrar em contato com a gente, né? Ainda era o telefone fixo, a gente não tinha nem celular, mas esse dinheiro rendeu muito. A gente fez muita coisa com esse dinheiro, tanto que esse cheque eu dormi por mais de 20 anos em cima dele, coloquei debaixo do meu colchão, que era para ele render, né? E ele rendeu, viu? Rendeu que hoje esse cheque, hoje ele está na nossa parede, ele faz parte da história do Vida, Corrida, né? E aí, conforme as coisas foram acontecendo, toda essa visibilidade que um prêmio dá para uma organização, não importa o valor. Pouco tempo depois, nós já tínhamos feito todas as maiores mídias escritas e faladas de toda a grande São Paulo, e veio convites para nós irmos para o exterior, falar sobre Vida, Corrida, e tudo aquilo para mim era um tanto quanto assustador. E aí eu conheci um jovem na REMS, né? Um jovem ainda oficineiro da Eprocard. E aí eu adoro conversar com os jovens, eu adoro pedir ajuda para os universitários, gente. Até hoje, tudo que eu sei é sempre pedindo ajuda para alguém. Eu não tenho vergonha de falar, eu não sei, eu quero aprender. Tanto que, eu vou falar aqui rapidinho, eu concluí os meus estudos aos 59 anos. Eu tive a coragem de ir para o EJA, da alfabetização de jovens e adultos, para concluir os meus estudos, né? Mas esse meu hábito da leitura me levou para o mundo. Eu falei na Assembleia Geral da ONU, na gestão do Barack Obama, isso para mim foi grandioso. E quando eu tive convites para ir para o exterior, de falar de políticas públicas na comunidade do bairro do Capão Redondo. E aí, com essa ajuda de todos desses jovens, né, principalmente de um jovem, ele está aqui, que é o Gerson, né? São os Fonseca, hoje são os Fonsecas, né? E aí esse jovem me ajudou muito para entender como fomentar políticas públicas, como captar recursos, como chegar em grandes empresas, né? E o Fonseca fez um trabalho extraordinário, e o Vida Corrida foi crescendo de uma tal maneira que as nossas crianças que brincavam de correr, algumas crianças não davam mais para brincar de correr, e eu, com aquele olhar já de treinamento, de Olimpíada, assim, gente, eu tenho que dar um jeito de dar asa para essas crianças, né? E essas crianças, a gente começou a levar algumas crianças para fazer peneiras no Centro Olímpico, né? E uma dessas crianças foi o Júlio César Agripino, um menino que acabou ficando cego no projeto Vida, Corrida. Ele era um atleta normal, né, convencional, e aí ele foi caindo em provas, e aí ele ficou cego, e com a ajuda de muita gente, de muita parceria, ele tomou a decisão que ele iria para um centro paralímpico, né? E com a ajuda de muita gente, em 2016, nós realizamos o sonho de ver Olimpíadas no nosso país. Olimpíadas que nunca mais eu vou ver no meu país. Eu tive o privilégio de conduzir a tocha olímpica e tive o privilégio de assistir Olimpíadas e Paralimpíadas. Sou muito grata a todo o time Nike por ter me proporcionado tudo isso. E nas Paralimpíadas, eu estava dentro do estádio do Engenhão. O Engenhão estava lotado, porque era a Paralimpíada, e aí deu ingresso para todas as comunidades, todas as vilas olímpicas estavam lá, ele estava lotado. E aí apareceu aquele telão gigantesco. Sabe o meu menino, que eu ensinei a brincar de correr no terrão do Capão Redondo? Ele estava naquele telão gigantesco, Júlio César Agripino, e todo mundo gritava o nome dele. Aquele dia foi um dos dias que... Sabe aquele sonho daquela menina de 14 anos, de 1974? Ele se realizou aquele dia. Por quê? Meu menino estava lá naquelas 4 raias, naquelas 10 raias, competindo com os melhores atletas do mundo. Ele não trouxe uma medalha de ouro, mas ele não desistiu. Foi para a segunda. Na segunda, ele pisou numa borda, perdeu a tão sonhada medalha dele. Na terceira Olimpíada, Paris 2024, meu menino, ele foi medalha de ouro nos 5.000. E se não bastasse tudo isso, ele ainda quebrou o recorde mundial nos 5.000. Hoje eu posso dizer, eu sou uma medalhista olímpica. Meu sonho está em cada menino daquele. No projeto da maluquinha que corre. Né? Até hoje eu gosto desse apelido carinhoso, da maluquinha que corre. A maluquinha que corre, que teve todos os seus direitos negados, o direito de estudar, o direito de ter uma família, o direito de ser uma atleta. Tudo que me foi negado hoje, eu busco para esses jovens. Hoje não é só esporte, hoje o Vida Corrida, através do esporte, o futuro nas mãos, nós temos muitos jovens hoje na universidade, muito deles, a universidade custeada 100% pela Nike, e muito deles, né, por méritos próprios, estão na USP, estão no Mackenzie, e todos bolsistas, 100%. Nossos jovens estão fazendo estágio nas empresas parceiras. Nossos jovens hoje são formados em educação física e são funcionários do Vida Corrida. Essas meninas que brincavam no Capão Redondo, hoje são mais de 16 no total em alto rendimento. Outras, tem o Jonathan, que seria o sucessor de Marilson Gomes, seria um grande maratonista. Com as lesões dele, ele se tornou o Dr. Jonathan. Hoje, Dr. Jonathan, ele é um médico da área esportiva. E aí, já pensou se eu tivesse, naqueles 10 anos, desistido de todos os meus sonhos? Nada disso teria acontecido. Porque eu sou gente que acredita que só vai ficar bom de verdade quando tiver bom para todo mundo. Porque a minha vida não tem linha de chegada. Porque a cada chegada eu estou planejando uma nova jornada. E eu tenho a plena certeza que eu, nem nenhum de vocês, é grande demais para fazer coisas pequenas. Na busca do meu propósito maior, eu limpo o banheiro do meu funcionário. Eu limpo a rua para as pessoas brincarem, praticar esporte, pessoas que eu nem conheço, com a mesma dignidade, e que eu pego no microfone e subo no palco e falo em rede nacional e assino um contrato com a maior marca esportiva do mundo. A mesma mulher que faz tudo isso é a mesma mulher que, no dia 15 de dezembro, eu estava na Rede Globo falando em rede nacional e recebi o mesmo prêmio que o César Tralli recebeu como o melhor jornalista do ano, eu recebi o prêmio como inspiração do ano. Eu tenho orgulho de mim mesma. Eu tenho orgulho do que eu construí com a ajuda de muitas pessoas, de muitas mulheres. Porque sonho que se sonha só, ele é só um sonho só. Sonho que se sonha junto torna-se realidade. E eu quero aqui citar uma frase que foi escrita por uma pessoa que ela não está aqui. Ela escreveu para mim. A esperança é a coisa mais jovem que existe. Por isso que tem gente que não envelhece nunca. Gente que mesmo nessa vida corrida nos faz esperançar todos os dias. Foi escrito por Bruno Teixeira, que enviou para mim. E agora eu quero que vocês vá até o Vida Corrida. Por favor. Passa o vídeo. Quando eu saio para correr, eu saí desse mundo, dessa violência, fugi de tudo isso. Eu viajava no tempo e naqueles momentos eu era a pessoa mais feliz do mundo. E aos 6 anos, minha mãe me entregou para adoção. Eu viajei para São Paulo. Nessa viagem aconteceu o meu primeiro abuso. E aos 14 anos eu comecei a brincar de correr na escola, na aula de educação física. E eu me apaixonei por esportes. Foi aí que começou essa grande vontade, essa esperança de que todo dia iria mudar. Quando eu cheguei aqui no Capão Redondo, o que mais acontecia aqui era violência, assassinatos. Sempre quando chegava o final de semana, íamos sair na rua, tinha uma pessoa morta, coberta com jornal. E essa comunidade, novamente, seu filho amado, tirou a minha família. Primeiro o meu marido e depois o meu filho. Se essa rua fosse minha, eu mandava ladrilhar com pedrinhas. O Vida Corrida nasceu depois que eu enterrei o meu filho. E depois que eu perdi o meu filho, eu aprendi a amar os filhos dos outros e a cuidar dos filhos dos outros, né? Tudo que tiraram de mim, todas as oportunidades que me foram negadas, hoje eu sonho com essas crianças. Quando eu ensino essas pessoas a correrem, eu não estou ensinando simplesmente esporte, também estou ensinando a elas para que elas tenham autonomia e que elas sonhem com um futuro melhor e sonhem com igualdade para todos. O Vida Corrida nasceu na esperança que a prática esportiva mudasse a realidade do nosso entorno na comunidade. Nós começamos com 6 mulheres. Hoje nós somos mais de 700 atendidos, né? Não enterramos mais nossos jovens. E a nossa comunidade respira e transpira esporte. O esporte me deu a esperança de um mundo melhor. E eu espero que essas crianças tenham essa mesma esperança que eu, de mudar o mundo, de sonhar com um mundo melhor. Eu acho que na vida eu tinha 2 escolhas, né? Com o passar do tempo. Vítima ou ser protagonista da minha própria história. E eu escolhi ficar com a segunda opção. Para o meu amor passar. Obrigada. Não mude seus sonhos, mude o mundo.
Muito obrigada, dona Neide. Suas palavras são sempre assim, né? Inspiradoras, emocionantes. A gente sempre traz ela com esse propósito de conectar com vocês, né? Porque ela sempre traz palavras muito emocionantes. Felipe.
É isso aí. Neide, parabéns e obrigado por compartilhar com a gente de novo. Pessoal, a gente vai seguir então com a programação e agora a gente vai passar à Conferência Internacional. Então, para quem precisar, lá fora, a gente tem os aparelhos da tradução simultânea, tá? É só deixar o documento, retira o aparelho, e quem está com o aparelho, na hora do almoço, devolve ele lá e pega o documento de volta, tá bom? Os aparelhos já estão sintonizados no canal onde vai ser feita a tradução, ok? E aí também, ao final da conversa, nós vamos ter as perguntas, né, para o Thomas, e a gente vai mediar, vai ler para ele as perguntas aqui, ele vai responder a vocês. Então, no bloquinho que vocês receberam, tem as tirinhas para fazerem as perguntas, tá? Então, logo após, durante a conferência, vocês podem ir anotando, fazendo as perguntas, depois vocês nos passam e a gente vai responder ao final, ok? Então, no contexto, a discussão vai ser limites e possibilidades do esporte no contexto da intolerância das injustiças globais, diante de um mundo que vem lidando com catástrofes climáticas, guerras, intolerância e crises de saúde mental. Como o esporte pode impactar a vida de crianças e jovens para refletir e criar novas realidades em busca de esperança? O nosso palestrante, então, hoje é o Thomas Carter, da Universidade de Brighton, na Inglaterra. Thomas é diretor da Football for Peace International, uma ONG que utiliza o jogo e a atividade física para ensinar sobre valores sociais e habilidades para a construção da paz e a reconciliação em comunidades afetadas por conflitos e violência. Sob sua liderança, a instituição tem atuado com parceiros locais na Colômbia, Gâmbia, Coreia do Sul, Irlanda do Norte e África do Sul. Ele também integra o conselho diretor de duas ONGs, a colombiana Fundación Buen Punto e a norte-americana Run the Base. Além disso, é professor associado de antropologia na Universidade de Brighton, na Inglaterra. Publicou mais de 50 artigos científicos e capítulos de livros e é autor de 7 livros sobre diversos aspectos do poder social e político, os usos e as limitações do esporte, sendo considerado um dos principais antropólogos do esporte no mundo. Então, Thomas, por favor, pode subir ao palco para conversar conosco. Recebam o Thomas, por favor, pessoal. Só lembrando a vocês que logo após a fala do Thomas, nós vamos ter 20 minutinhos para as respostas das perguntas e mais 5 minutos, onde o Thomas vai fazer as considerações finais. Então, por favor, não deixem de fazer as perguntas, não deixem de manter o diálogo aberto, ok? Então, vamos lá.
I have to make sure my phone does not make any noise. 1 second. Yeah. Okay. Right. Are the interpreters ready? Yeah? Great. Thank you. I would like to begin with an apology. And my apology is this. I am sorry I do not speak Portuguese. So I am very grateful for the interpreters and their hard work. And I hope I speak clearly and slowly enough that they can actually make everything that I am trying to say clear to you. I also would like to thank the advisory board of REMS and Anna in particular for their invitation to come to Sao Paulo. It is an absolute privilege to be here and to talk with you this morning. There's a few things I would like to do this morning in terms of subjects we will talk about. But to start with, you just heard a little bit of my biography, but I'd like to give you a little bit more information about that so you have a better idea of what my position is and where my thinking comes from. Sport has been a major component or part of my life as an activity, as an athlete, and as a coach, as an object of study, as a researcher, and as a way for understanding people, understanding communities, understanding politics and power around the world. Those three different aspects, however, create very different kinds of knowledge about sport. So as you heard, I am director of something called Football for Peace, and have been since 2016. 10 years in the sector of sport for development is a long time. But what I would like to say about that is I took on that role reluctantly. I took on that role because my good friend was director of Football for Peace, which he started in 2001. But he suddenly and quickly became very seriously ill. And it looked like Football for Peace was going to collapse. So I did get involved. And by accident, more than anything else, I ended up in that position of responsibility of being the leader of the organization. In doing that, and I could take over that role because of my other role, which is to be a professor at a university, where I have taught many different subjects. But what I teach, most of all, is critical thinking and research methods. In other words, I do not teach students specialized subjects, things like sports coaching or physical education or sport management or other technical skills of that sort. Rather, what I do is teach students how to think, not what to think. And I ask students that they start to question what it is they think they know. That is, I ask them to start thinking about themselves, about the community, about the society in which they live, and about how they think they know those things. And most especially about what are the kinds of evidence that demonstrates what they think they know about themselves and their communities. And I believe it is this particular pedagogical position that I have that has led me to being here today in front of you. I've been asked to talk about the limits and possibilities of sport in addressing intolerance and global justice. And what we are really talking about is the use of sport for social change and sport's ability to create that kind of change. It is a question in terms of the use of sport, and the stories that we just heard and the presentations that we had yesterday as well provide a great deal of stories about certain kinds of change. That change can be individual, it could be social, it could be economic, or it could be structural, beyond what happens in a sports club or in the field of competition. So what I would like to do this morning then, in focusing on the limits and possibilities of sport to cause change, I will mostly speak about the possibilities, because as I do, I believe the limits to sport's ability to generate change will become apparent. What I will do then, and what I will talk about now moving forward, is about the following. First thing I'd like to do is I would like to talk a little bit about what we think we know about sport. And then moving from that into what I call the ideology of sport. and from the ideology of sport, have a quick discussion and examine a little bit the kinds of evidence that we have that indicates that sport can change the world. From that examination of that evidence, then, what should become apparent is what some of the limitations are to sport's capacity to create change. Out of that part, then, I would like to discuss the broader context of sport for change and what that global project looks like. And stemming from that, fifth, how that broader project does or does not address global injustice and, by default, intolerance. And then finally, I would like to provide some propositions to you about sport for change for you to think about and consider, so that by the end, hopefully, I will have provoked you into thinking about sport itself, about your own ethos and values and practices that you use when you engage in sport or teach sport or coach sport. What I will not be doing is giving you any sort of definitive answers of what you should be doing. So what I would, yeah. So, okay. So, what we are told is sport can do a number of amazing things, as you can see up on the screens here. What we are told is that sport can reduce poverty. Sport can improve people's health, not just individually, but whole communities. We are told that sport can educate people. We are also told that sport can reduce inequality, most especially gender inequality. We are also told that sport can stop violent extremism. Sport can prevent terrorism. We are also told that sport can lower or prevent crime. We are also told that sport can create jobs and is good for the economy. We are also told that sport helps to build peace. And then we are also told that sport can be used to reduce violence overall. All of these claims of what sport can do are made by a variety of international bodies coming from the United Nations. These are in their documents, they are in that. Whether we talk about the International Olympic Committee, which is now a recognized United Nations body. It became one about 6 or 7 years ago after 50 years of political infighting between the United Nations and the International Olympic Committee. Very quietly, and it stays quiet, but it was publicly announced that the International Olympic Committee is the United Nations body for sport. The other organizations up there, I'm sorry that the acronyms are in English, but we have the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, UNESCO, the United Nations Children's Fund, which was originally the International Children's Emergency Fund, UNICEF, UNODC, the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, and the United Nations Office for Sport for Development and Peace, and I'll come to that, I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second, and the World Health Organization. But we are also told by national governments around the world that sport can do all of these things as well. Policymakers all over the world assert that sport is a powerful agent for change. The United Nations Office for Sport for Development and Peace was formed in 2001, where it was recognized that sport in particular had a unique and special role in reducing conflict and building peace in communities that have suffered from some form of structural violence. And for the next 15 years, this small office promoted and worked with a variety of organizations to produce the evidence that this would happen. But in 2017, the United Nations decided to close that office. Not because they weren't doing a good job, but because in their view, sport was so effective that it should not be centralized to one small office, but instead should be used as a tool to address all of these other particular social ills and challenges. So they did not need a specialized office for sport because sport is so fantastic at doing all of these different things. The reason they believe that, and what they're talking about then, is what sport actually is, or what we think it is. It is what I call the ideology of sport. And most of all, what we already know, and all of you know this, you grew up with this, you know this so well you don't even think about it, that sport is good. It's unquestionable, sport is good. Otherwise we wouldn't be doing it. But that particular sport, whatever the sport is that good is moral and universal, right? We hear from the United Nations, from various policymakers and what have you, and dignitaries and celebrities, that sport is a universal language. That sport is a universal good. It does not matter what you do or where you are, it is always good. And this is what we call the great sport myth. That sport is good. And not only is sport good, but it is inherently good. And this is how the myth works. Sport is inherently good. Therefore, the people who are practicing sport or who are involved in sport are therefore inherently good people. Because those people are inherently good, because they're involved in sport, the things that they do are inherently good. This is the myth, the ideology behind the belief in sport. And there are parallels here with religions. In fact, with most religions. It does not matter if we are talking about Christianity, or we're talking about Judaism, or we're talking about Islam. Whatever the religion, the idea is, quite simply, that if you are a believer in that particular worldview, that particular religion, you either are a good person or you have the potential to become a good person. And that parallels very neatly with the belief in sport. So good, when we say sport is good, is we are making a moral judgment. We are assigning a moral value to sport. And it's based on certain values. And you all know these values because we learn them as children and have it reinforced as adults. The first of these, as you can see up there, beyond sport being good, is that sport is fair. We all know this, right? Sport is fair. In two particular ways, right? First of all, in terms of fairness, sport is equitable. We all agree to play by the same rules, so that we know when we enter into a competition and we get involved, that everybody agrees this is how that particular activity is going to be done. Now, while we may agree to play by those rules, what does not get asked is who gets to make the decision about what those rules shall be. The second part of the value of fairness in sport is that sport is meritocratic. In other words, everybody who's involved in sport, as long as they work hard, they will rise to their ability and they will have success up to the level of their ability. That's a wonderful belief, and sport is meritocratic, and the merits of the person are what judges the individual. But it doesn't address the question of who has access to sport. It ignores socioeconomic and political factors. Another value and another belief in sport is that sport is inclusive. Sport built teamwork is a particular value that or evidence of the idea that sport is inclusive, that we work as a group for group goals, for the betterment of society, for the betterment of the sports team. And also being inclusive and being a good team member is that you play well with others, right? That you play well with others, that you work together towards a common goal. So that inclusivity then builds social relationships. And then, of course, we are also told that sport is healthy. The sport, quite simply, is good for you. Physically, mentally, increasingly we hear that now, and socially. What I'm pointing out here is, as much as we focus on the technical skills in sport, as much as we develop the athlete, as much as we develop sports clubs and social institutions in the community, at the very base level of what sport is and does, is it teaches social values. It teaches us what is most important in our lives and in our communities. Football for Peace, the organization that I lead, has what we call a values-based pedagogy. We do not teach technical skills at all. We do not and have no interest in developing athletes. What we are interested in is building the whole person, supporting the whole person holistically. So because if we are going to create social change, this is what our particular view is, if we were going to create social change in the terms of reducing violence, reducing conflict, building peace, and so forth, you have to teach certain social values that otherwise might be taken for granted. As examples, the core values that we teach in Football for Peace are basic ones: trust, respect, responsibility, equity, and inclusion, which ties into, of course, the ideology of sport as well. This belief in sport and its power is so strong that in 2000, you probably recognize the gentleman here, Nelson Mandela gave a speech at the inauguration of an organization called Glorious Sport for Good. It is a particular speech that is often quoted in sport for development circles, amongst organizations in sport for change, and so forth. And in particular, Mr. Mandela talked about the power of sport. And in his own biography, he talked about how sport was particularly important when he was a prisoner in South Africa, and how the prisoners used sport to maintain hope and to build various sorts of other skills, social skills, leadership skills, and so forth. Upon being freed in South Africa then, and Mr. Mandela became president of South Africa, he used sport as a vehicle to try and promote social change in South Africa, culminating with the 1995 Rugby World Cup. And in that, and coming from those experiences, then Mr. Mandela talks about how rugby, a sport in South Africa, was seen as a white sport, how that was used to try and transform the way South Africans understood themselves, their communities, and their social relations. The extent to which that was successful is debatable. But what Mr. Mandela did say up here is that sport can create hope where once there was only despair. And we just heard that 30 minutes ago in the stories that you gave us. That was wonderful. That's exactly what sport can do. Mr. Mandela claims that sport is more powerful than governments in breaking down barriers. And the most important part, the part that's underlined there, sport has the power to change the world. Yes, sport can certainly create hope where there is only despair. Sport can be more powerful than governments in breaking down barriers. That, of course, is making the assumption that governments want to break down those barriers. It's not necessarily in the interest of the people who are powerful to get rid of the barriers. So sport can do that, but it doesn't necessarily mean it will. And lastly, sport has the power to change the world. Yes, it certainly does. There's no question about that. But what do we mean by change, first of all? If sport can change the world, what do we mean by change? The presumption here, in what Mr. Mandela is saying, is that change is going to be positive. Right? That sport brings people together. It helps build communities. What doesn't get recognized or acknowledged is sport can do the opposite as well. Sport can split communities. It can cause violence. It can cause conflict. So while this is a wonderful message, it's only partially correct. At the time that Mr. Mandela made this speech, and if you actually, Laureus, Sport for Good, the organization, has just re-put up the entire speech on their website as a 25th anniversary. So if you want to hear the whole speech, you can get that. But in particular with what Mr. Mandela was saying is that this is a force for good. In other words, he is an advocate of the myth, the great sport myth. Now, that's not a bad thing, but it's not a critical approach. What is the evidence that sport actually changes the world or even creates social change? Now, I spent this morning going around looking at all of the lovely presentations of the various organizations on their projects and the wonderful work that they do. And it is important work. And it was interesting to me to look at the kinds of evidence that was being given about how successful those programs are, about the impact those programs have. And on the screens here, you have 3 programs and the evidence that our partners with Football for Peace have also presented. And this will look familiar to you, right? If we look at the first program, about changing people's behaviors or attitudes, and then about the skills or knowledge or personal effectiveness that has come about because of the program, and then the changes in quality of life or well-being. This is standard evidence that is presented in the Sport for Change sector around the world. All right? So in the first program, 318 young people between the ages of 15 and 24 report that their attitudes were improved in trying to find work after taking part in the program. It's a lovely outcome. Don't get me wrong. And then also out of that 318, 128 of those young people improved their interviewing skills or developed their skills at writing a CV so they could find employment because of the workshops that they worked in with this particular organization. And then from that then, 98 of those young people then entered into sustained employment. They got jobs. Or the second program, similar sorts of things. 225 young people of the same age group talked about how their attitudes changed, about their potential to participate in the economy and pursue the idea of starting a business. And that because of their participation in the program, 176 of those young people have improved knowledge on entrepreneurship, running a business, and starting a micro or small business. It's education. And out of that, 53 of those young people start sport-related micro businesses, small businesses. Or the third program, in which 127 young women reported that they were attending school more frequently. That 76 of those young women improve their actual results in their educational process because of being involved in the particular sport for development program. And 44 of them got a high school diploma or the equivalent thereof. Now, all of this is evidence of a couple of different things. The first thing that this is evidence of is the effectiveness of the delivery of the program. There is very little to no evidence here of any social change whatsoever. We have the outcome of the program in which young people reported a change in attitude, right? And of developing certain skills. And the logic in terms of sport for social change is that because young people get more skills or learn a little bit more and feel better about themselves by participating in a program, that has changed their lives. That last step. The evidence for that is minimal at best. Now, this is not the fault of any of these particular organizations. It is not the fault of any of the organizations that were presenting what their important work is up there. It is a problem of the sector. It is a problem that stems from both policymakers and funders, the people who provide the resources, the organizations that provide the resources of what they want of the people who are actually delivering their programs. Because if we look at this at the last column, the quality of life and well-being, 98 beneficiaries entered into sustained employment. In other words, they got a job. What we don't know is what kind of job that was. What we don't know is how long were they employed for. What we don't know is whether or not that job paid a living wage. In other words, was the job paying enough of a salary that people could actually lift themselves out of poverty? In program 2, 53 young people start sport-related micro businesses or small businesses. So we know they started a business. We have no idea how successful that business is. We do not know if that business collapsed and went out of business in 6 months' time. Or, lastly, 44 beneficiaries completed their secondary education. That's a little bit better in terms of evidence. In the simple reality that we can make a logical chain that because these young women participated in the Sport for Development program, that is the reason why they got their high school education. But that's fairly thin evidence. My point is this. All of the positive change that happens, of making people feel good, which is what sport does, about changing people's attitudes and behaviors, or about improving some of their skills and personal effectiveness, is about the individual. It is not about effective social change. There's no guarantee there, and there's very little to no evidence of that. Now, I am not the first person to point this out. The other leader of South Africa, the Archbishop Desmond Tutu, the other South African that won the Nobel Peace Prize with Nelson Mandela, wrote in a personal letter to my friend who was the director of Football for Peace before me when we were working in South Africa about the benefits and the power of what was happening in terms of the programs. And he said this: sport does have a meaningful and powerful role to play in society, or in the social transformation of society. In other words, sport has a powerful and meaningful role to create change. If care is taken to provide the necessary conditions for success. The most important word in that sentence is one of the shortest. The word if. If the necessary conditions for success, meaning creating social change, are not met, it doesn't matter how wonderful your program is. One of the failings of many partners and many organizations I have encountered around the world is that those organizations know little to nothing about the communities in which they work. They do not know what the conditions are that are necessary for creating social change. Yet they create and run very successful programs. Right? The question becomes, what are those programs? Now, I am being self-critical here as well. When Football for Peace started working in the Gambia, there was a question about why we were going to the Gambia, besides the fact that we were invited by a local organization. Because the Gambia does not have a long history of structural violence, of civil war, or anything of that sort. So one of the questions we had to ask ourselves is, well, what is going on in these communities where we might be needed? Because we have limited resources and we might be needed somewhere else. And when we talked to the Gambians initially, we were told there's no conflict here. No, everybody gets along. However, by doing a little bit of research and a little bit of investigation, of talking to people in the 4 different communities in which Football for Peace works there, what emerged was that there was actually a long history of ethnic violence, to the point that 2 of those communities were formed within living memory within the last 50 years because those particular ethnic groups were driven out of the other communities. But nobody actually would say that to us. We had to do some research and some talking to people and finding out the history of each of the communities and why they were there and what their own histories were. We had to learn what the conditions were to have any chance of success. The other thing I want to say about the conditions for success, and about success in particular, is what the evidence is that we have overall is evidence of a successful delivery of a program, not of social change. Now, I said that earlier, but I'm repeating it because it's very important. That doesn't mean that the programs aren't doing good. That does not mean that the work that is being done is not important. But what it does do is it raises some questions about what we mean by social change. If we're going to recognize that there is a need to know what the necessary conditions are, if we return back to the United Nations, in 2015, the United Nations announced the Sustainable Development Goals, right? 17 different goals that are to change the world, with targets in each one of those goals. And sport is to be a tool to help reach all of them. Whether we are talking about clean water and clean environments, or we're talking about education, or we're talking about better health, or we're talking about peaceable societies with no conflict. Now, this is a diagram from one of the UN documents. You can find this on the website easily enough if you Google it. And there's a couple of different ways to understand this and the way the United Nations talks about the Sustainable Development Goals, the conditions for change. For improving people's lives. This set of goals is based on a certain set of values as well. And we can understand that and the priorities of those values by looking at this particular diagram or other diagrams like it. And there's a couple of different ways to understand this. In one sense, if you look at this, we have 3 circles in which the environment, the biosphere, is the outside one, the middle one is society, and at the center is the economy. Well, generally, if you have a series of concentric circles, the most important part is the bullseye in the middle. So the economic goals are more important than the social goals, are more important than the environmental ones. That's one way to interpret it. It's not necessarily the correct way. Notice I'm not saying right or wrong here. Another way to look at this is, in general, when you look at particular physical diagrams like this, the most important is the point of the pyramid at the top. So once again, we have the economy as being the most important part. That's a way to look at it. You could also look at it the other way. Right? You could look at it and say, well, if we don't take care of the environment, then we have massive social problems and we have to take care, and society needs to be taken care of. And if we don't take care of society, then we don't have an economy. So you could look at it in either direction and understand it in either direction. However, when you start using sport to try and meet the targets of these goals, the discussion around the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, revolves around a certain set of values, not the same values that sport has. They are values in which the individual is the important person. That each of you is responsible for your own health, for your own success, for the wealth you create, for your education, and so forth. What we know as neoliberal ideology. That each of you is a neoliberal person in a free market, in a capitalist world. The other thing then about the Sustainable Development Goals is they are not about altering the hierarchy of power in the world. They want social change, they're advocating for social change, but only a certain kind of social change. in which the people who are impoverished, the people who are marginalized, shall have their lives improved as long as they stay where they are. All right? Now, the reason why sport is used in this way is because of the values of sport that we know from the myth of sport and how they work so well with the neoliberal values. We know sport. We know the values of sport around discipline and hard work. Those are the same values that are espoused by the idea of your own success in life, that you are individually responsible, that it's not the community that helps lift you up, the support of others, as we heard earlier, but only you yourself. And these values around fair play and teamwork. And I mentioned discipline. And as long as you work hard, you will be rewarded. You'll succeed. Some of the other values in sport that we talk about, like respect. One of the things about sport that teaches us in terms of respect is in that value of fairness, to play by the rules. Well, I asked earlier, who sets the rules? In society and the world, who is setting the rules? If you train hard and work hard, do what your coaches tell you, and when in competition, do not question the referee's decision. That is an interesting set of values to approach things, because what that is teaching you is, one, not to question authority, or there'll be consequences. And two, those self-same values around teamwork, fair play, responsibility, respect, hard work, discipline, endurance, perseverance are the same values that train people to be good workers for the bosses. So when we're talking about sport for social change, the question is, what kind of change are we talking about? And if we're going to talk about social change and addressing things like global injustice, right? What do we mean by global injustice? Well, global injustice refers to the unequal distribution of resources, of opportunities, and power across the world. Global justice refers to how those particular circumstances, those conditions, results in significant differences, disparities, in the well-being among individuals and nations. And of course, global injustice then encompasses various forms of unfairness. The opposite of sports values, right, about fairness, including economic inequality, social injustice, and unequal access to basic necessities like healthcare and education. Intolerance is part of that set of values within global injustice. Sport is used to attack and address all forms of intolerance, whether it's racism, prejudice against certain religions, misogyny, sexuality, right? Anything that marks people as being different. Sport is used to break down those barriers, as Mr. Mandela said, in terms of attacking intolerance. Changing intolerance to tolerance, however, is not about social change. Because to tolerate something means that, yes, it's there, I don't particularly like it, but I'll put up with it. It doesn't mean that we're going to change the circumstances. We're going to change the social relations. We're going to change the power hierarchy. In the United Kingdom, you hear this a lot in the last 4 or 5 years around the question of immigration. All these foreigners coming to England. We don't want them anymore. We will put up with them. We will tolerate their presence. But it says nothing about actually the social conditions in which those people are there, or addressing the particular challenges those people have. This is true in every country in the world in a variety of ways. So can sport be used to address, challenge, and attack intolerance? Yes. Can it be used to create tolerance? Certainly. But it's not enough. Not if you're going to create social change. To use one of the Sustainable Development Goals as a quick example. Goal number 5 is about gender equity. Sport is used around the world to attempt to meet the targets of that particular Sustainable Development Goal. About 1/3 of all the NGOs in the world that use sport are in some way, shape, or form attempting to empower girls and women. It's a fantastic goal. There's nothing wrong with that whatsoever, and they do great work. However, having young girls or young women get involved in sport without addressing the conditions of patriarchy in the society is not necessarily going to create social change. It could, but what are the consequences of teaching 12 and 13 and 14-year-old girls that they have just as equal value as the boys do? They have just as much right to play sports, that they should have a career, that they should get an education, that they have the same rights as the boys do. And they learn this. You see that in the outcomes of the programs. They learn this. And then they go home. And their older brother or their uncle or their father or their grandfather or their mother or their older sister tells them to do some things, and the little girl says, well, no, actually, I have just as much right to go to school as my brother does. I should be going to school. And the consequences of that is that the young girl gets beaten. Unfortunately, I have seen this far too often. It's not understanding the conditions in which the programs are being delivered and what the potential consequences are of that. So yes, sport can change the world. Yes, sport can empower young women and girls. But if all you're doing is empowering young women and girls to play more sport, you're also potentially putting them at greater risk. This is true not only for dealing with gender, but dealing with any other particular group. And being inclusive. Being inclusive means you tolerate people's presence. It doesn't mean you're changing things. So what I'd like to leave you with, last bit here, thank you for your patience, is some propositions about what it is the Sport for Social Change sector as a whole does. It is driven, in particular, by a relationship between the practice that you guys do as organizations and communities and policymakers, and that relationship between those two. And policy works basically to mobilize and legitimize political support. That's what policy does. In other words, to justify certain things. But it doesn't actually tell you what to do in practice. And this is what the Sustainable Development Goals do. They say, here are the targets. But they don't say how to go about actually achieving those targets. Which means the interventions then, the programs that all of you deliver, have nothing to do with the policies. Policies change all the time. In many countries, the policies change with every change of government. But most of the organizations that I saw out there have been working for at least 10, 15, 20 years or more. Which means you've been through at least 2 or 3 different governments with changes in policies. But you are still doing what you do. The point being, what you do is not driven by policy, but by your own organization's needs. What you need to do to achieve your goals. However, your goals and what you're doing also is necessary to maintain the relationships with policymakers, with government agencies, who are, of course, also some of the funders of the programs. So your projects that you do, and what you guys do as this is you have to work very, very hard to convince the policymakers, to convince the funders that what you do meets their agenda, not your agenda. And this is where the disjuncture and the problem lies within the sector. You have to work very, very hard to show that what you do meets what the policymakers are saying are the new ideas. And that your work is coherent, that you've been working on this for a long period of time. Even though all of you are very much aware that your funding might be for a year or 2 years or 3 years if you're really lucky. Very short term. The fact that that all of these organizations that you guys belong to and that you've been working on and work with have been working for 15, 20 years speaks to your own resilience and your own ability to make things happen. Says nothing about policy. Which brings me to the 4th one, and the question of evidence. Sport for development and peace, sport for social change is a relatively new idea. I'm curious, of the people in this room, would you raise your hands if you were born in 1995 or later? So if you are roughly 30 years of age or younger. Yeah, okay, about half. As far as you guys are aware, this is the way it's always been. Sport for social change is a good idea. Prior to the year 2000, prior to 1995, the idea of using sport for social change was considered a joke. Nobody believed in the power of sport to change things. When we don't have time to talk about why that has changed. But the idea that sport can be used for positive social change is a new idea. It is so new, and what is interesting about this is that in those 25 years since Mr. Mandela gave his speech in 2000, there have literally been thousands of projects done around the world. Probably hundreds of thousands of projects by thousands of organizations. Yet not one of those projects has ever failed. Every single one is a success. Is that believable? However, there's a very good reason for that. The reason for that is, if you as an organization get funding from a particular government ministry or from the Nike Foundation or whatever the funder might be, what would happen if you said, yes, we got this money and we delivered this project and it was an absolute disaster? Nothing went right, nothing succeeded. What would happen to your organization? Would that same funder consider funding you again? Probably not. Projects do not fail. Where the failure comes in is the broader network between funders and policymakers and the organizations that deliver the programs. That is where the failure lies. Because the organizations are required to demonstrate that they're delivering an effective program. That is the requirements of most funders. We want to know how many people were involved, for how long, and did they have a change in attitude? All that tells us is whether or not the program was delivered and how effective that delivery was. It tells us nothing about social change. Which means the success and failure of your project are not judgments based on what you do and your own self-judgment. It's an evaluation oriented towards a particular policy. Now, these are propositions. I'm not stating these as facts. I want you to consider your own position and what your experience is with your organizations and decide for yourselves how accurate these propositions are. Right? So, you've been very patient, so I'm going to wrap this up. I have not provided you with any definitive answers as to what sport can and cannot do. And I've done this for two reasons. One, quite simply, is we don't have the evidence as to whether or not sport can actually create social change, positively or negatively. We have lots of evidence that programs can be delivered. But do they actually generate change? Possibly. The second aspect of that is we have a problematic link between the development of skills and attitudes in the individual and the quality of life, not only of that person, but whether or not those skills and attitudes go beyond the individual into the community and change the community itself. Part of the dilemma here is a question of scale. Can sport create change? Most definitely, yes, at the individual level. We have lots of evidence of that. We have lots of personal stories about that. Can sport change communities and create social change? There's some examples that suggest that's a possibility. When we're talking about a small community, a neighborhood, a small rural village in the countryside, something like that. Can sport change the way a country operates and the relations in a particular country? That evidence is much harder to actually find if it exists. And can sport change the world on a global level and fight global injustice? Not at that scale. There's no evidence for that whatsoever. In fact, it doesn't really even fit the agenda of the Sustainable Development Goals. It does at a local level, again at the community level for neighbors, in schools, amongst families, that sort of thing. Now, so the other thing then is what matters is the context in which you work. If you're going to create that change, you have to know what is the situation you're working in. So ultimately, I am convinced that there are significant limits to what sport can do to generate social and economic change in particular. But I am also convinced there are the potential opportunities for sport to create social change. I've seen it amongst individuals in small communities. In many of the countries in which Football for Peace works, we work in places that have what are called divided communities, in which there are two social groups, ethnic or religious, in which each community never visits the other community. They know nothing about them. The most prominent example, and the first example of that, would be the work that we did in Northern Ireland, in the United Kingdom, right? Northern Ireland is part of the United Kingdom. It is a divided part of the country between the Irish Catholic and the British Protestant populations, in which you can have a small farming community of 2,000 or 3,000 people who are British Protestant live next to a community 5 kilometers down the road who are Irish Catholic. Uh-oh. Right? The children from the one community don't visit the other community. They don't know, the families don't know anybody in the other community. The sports that are taught in the schools are different sports. You know which side of the community a person belongs to based on what sport they play. So, by all means, to wrap this up, because I'm running out of time, as a typical academic does, believe in sport. Believe in its ideology. Have faith in it, definitely. Use that faith. It's powerful. Sport can change the world. All I ask is that you do not have blind faith. I do not expect any of you to agree with what I was saying this morning, but what I hope is I have provoked you to start or to continue to question what it is you do, and more importantly, how and why you do it. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Muito obrigada, Thomas, por compartilhar conosco este conteúdo tão importante. Nós recebemos aqui algumas perguntas. Se alguém tiver mais alguma pergunta, o momento é agora, né? Tem. Já vai chegar aqui. Felipe, pode iniciar.
Vamos lá. Thomas, a pergunta da Pamela é: em um contexto de alta vulnerabilidade diante de um trauma, como a interdisciplinaridade deve atuar no processo de trabalho?
Can you repeat the question, please?
Vamos lá. Em um contexto de alta vulnerabilidade diante de um trauma, como a interdisciplinaridade deve atuar no processo de trabalho no esporte?
Oh, that's a complicated question. How? The first part of that comes back to the point of understanding the context in which you work. I'm not sure what you mean by disciplines. Are we referring to the disciplines of sport or academic disciplines? Or what? So whoever asked the question, can you clarify, please? Okay. Okay, so academic disciplines. Thank you. Okay. The challenge of academic disciplines is that each one specializes on a particular topic. So psychology, for example, focuses on the study of the mind. A sociologist focuses on studying society, which means they have certain assumptions about what people are. Mhm. An economist, for example, would focus on the economy and how the economy works. All of them can work on the same project, ask the same question, how to create social change, use the same data, and come up with very different answers. Which means to do interdisciplinary work requires understanding the context of the kinds of questions being asked, as well as the evidence being generated. The last bit I'll say about this, we can understand sport in many different ways. At the beginning, I said I'm an anthropologist. Mm-hmm. I am trained as an anthropologist, and the discipline of anthropology studies what it means to be human. So even if you take a sociologist and an anthropologist, and we can do exactly the same thing and work together, the sociologist is going to come out with an answer that's focused on society, whereas the anthropologist will be on what it is to be human in terms of how sport affects that. I hope that answers your question.
Alô? Gente, vamos lá? Pergunta do Marcelo, lá do IGK. O mundo anda doente. Recentemente, o Putin foi questionado se atacaria Israel em apoiar o Irã. Na resposta, disse que não atacaria porque tem identidade com o país, porque tem muitos russos por lá. A questão é, como o esporte pode ser utilizado para ser a identidade, de forma que crie um ambiente de paz entre as nações?
Well, first of all, I'm not sure you should believe anything that Putin says. As to whether or not Russia would attack Israel, no idea. The idea of sport promoting peace amongst nations is the ideology of Olympism. It is the Olympic mission. It says so in the charter. It is a lovely story, but if you look at it historically, in terms of the modern Olympic Games, in every Olympic Games, there's supposed to be the Olympic peace, in which all of the countries that are at war are supposed to put down their weapons and stop fighting for the duration of the games. It's never happened. Can sport be used diplomatically? Yes, and it has been. Two examples, very quickly. The first one between the United States and China. In the 1970s, during the Cold War, the government of the United States and the government of China did not recognize one another. There was a table tennis tournament in Japan in which an American athlete accidentally got on the wrong bus that was carrying the Chinese team. And there was an exchange of patches, pins, that sort of thing, that created a public media event that suggested that through ping pong, through table tennis, the governments could start talking to each other. And President Nixon was the first American president to then visit China The second example is more recent. It's similar in terms of Cold War politics. Is about 10 years ago. 10 years ago? When Obama was president, he went to Havana for an exhibition baseball game between the Cuban national team and a professional Major League Baseball team. That was again being used as a way to open up relations between the Cuban government and the United States government. That dialogue occurred while Obama was president. And then there was an election and Obama was no longer president. And you had a complete change of policy on the American side. So there is a possibility there, but it's one that's difficult. Mm-hmm.
Bom, essa é uma perguntinha um pouco maior, dividida em duas partes. Eu só não tenho o nome da pessoa que perguntou. Mas a pergunta é o seguinte: o senhor afirma que o esporte não promove a mudança social por si só. Mas pergunto, se os programas sociais têm o poder de mudar positivamente os indivíduos, não podemos assumir que os indivíduos destes projetos promoveram mudanças positivas no seu entorno? E se, em consequência, ao redor, né, a mudança do indivíduo não será, portanto, o foco de toda a organização que atua para a mudança social através do esporte?
No, that was very good. Thank you. The interpreter did a great job on that question. The first part of the question, you're absolutely correct. That we make the presumption that the individual will have a particular change that will then lead to greater social change. That is what we have. What I'm saying is we have very little evidence that that assumption is true. By extension, if I understood the second part, is if the assumption of the first part is true, that the individual can make social change in the community, that individual could become a politician, let's say, and become prime minister or president of their country, and because of that individual change, generate new policies and create change in the country. Certainly that's a possibility. It's a question of evidence again. Interestingly, where we see the likelihood of this happening is with elite athletes, either Olympic athletes or professional athletes, who, because of their celebrity and the great sport myth, in which they are presumed to be good people, means they are highly electable as leaders. You can see this in the United States government, in the Congress, where there are at least 8 or 9 former professional athletes who are members of Congress. Ronald Reagan was an American football player as well as actor and got elected as president. But you also have people like the Liberian footballer George Weah, who played internationally and professionally in Europe, who became the president of Liberia based on his celebrity of being a national prominent athlete. And we had the same thing in Pakistan with Amir Khan as an international cricketer. So there are plenty of examples of an athlete who has had great success in their sporting career being able to change that into success in a political career. But that doesn't mean they're actually trying to create social change. That's, again, individual success in terms of political changes or being part of the political system. It doesn't mean it can't happen.
Vamos para mais uma pergunta. Essa
Really hard.
é da Leidiane Souza, do Instituto CADES. Como a Futebol for Peace lida com as contradições de atuar em países marcados pelo colonialismo britânico dentro de um sistema capitalista que muitas vezes reforça desigualdades? De que forma vocês evitam reproduzir essas lógicas e valorizam, de fato, os saberes e necessidades dessas comunidades? Boa pergunta.
Fabulous question. And we can do nothing about the history of the British Empire. It is what it is. It has to do with the attitude of Football for Peace as an organization. And it relates very much to the presentation we had last night on decolonizing sport and decolonizing society. The first thing I would say about Football for Peace is that we are never going to resolve any conflict. Football for Peace worked in the West Bank and in Israel for 12 years. We can hardly say that there's peace in Israel at the moment. What sport can do is be one very small piece of a very large puzzle. That is the belief of the people that work in Football for Peace. To answer the question then about how we operate and justify what we do, the first thing I would say is that we never go anywhere we are not invited. We work with local organizations and local partners when they invite us to come work with them. The second thing that we do is listen. We listen to the organization, but the other thing we do, and more importantly, is we listen to the people in the community in which the project is being proposed. For two reasons. The first reason is to allow us to understand the context. But the second reason is, what are the social values that are most important to that community? I mentioned in my talk the core values of Football for Peace. Respect, responsibility, trust, and so on. But those can mean very different things in different communities. And in some cases, those may not be the most important values of that community. The important thing to do is to teach the values that are most important for that community. Right? So we adjust what we do to fit the context, not the other way around. Success for us is we no longer work there. That we have provided a pedagogy and built the capacity of the local organization to help them achieve their goals, that they don't need us any longer. Great question.
A próxima pergunta, Thomas, ela já veio em inglês. Então, eu ia lhe pedir a gentileza de ler para o público a pergunta e, em seguida, seguir com a resposta, ok?
I need my eyes. How does Football for Peace address these limitations presented and also the potential negative side of sports? Good Lord, what a question. How do we address the limitations? Football for Peace by no means is not perfect. We make mistakes all the time. The criticisms I made about the evidence, Football for Peace has done for the last 20 years, where we've only been changing our practices in the last 3 or 4 to try and generate more of the evidence of social change as opposed to effective delivery of a program. The other aspect of addressing those limitations is being very choosy with whom we work, who our partners will be. In the last 5 years since COVID, I have turned down more offers of partnerships than one that we have accepted because of some of the values and ethos of those organizations and their practices. So it's being aware of what we do and being very reflective in what we do to ensure we're meeting our own goals. As for the potential negative side of sports, well, I think it has to do with the ethos of Football for Peace. But not just Football for Peace, for any of the organizations here. We believe sport can do good. Otherwise, we wouldn't do what we do. We do not work and we do not use sport to create divisions. We do not use sport to promote hatred. There are plenty of people that do that. So the potential negative sides of sport will be the ones that you encounter in delivering those programs, including Football for Peace. When you are dealing with communities in conflict, the population of that community is often self-selective. What I mean is that the people who wish to take part in that program would like to limit or get rid of the conflict in the community already. Otherwise, they would not take part. That doesn't mean there are people in the community who do not want us there.
Temos mais uma pergunta da Leidiane Souza. Gostaria de entender melhor como a organização de vocês se atua dentro da própria Inglaterra, pensando em ações decoloniais, tanto como dentro da instituição, como as comunidades inglesas.
You guys have such great questions. Football for Peace's work in England is very limited, although that is changing as well recently. There are parts of England and Northern Ireland where we have worked in which there are a variety of conflicts and ethnic division, religious division. Where we work in England, again, depends on who our partners are. So we don't do anything on our own. So one project we did was a project with 4 organizations in London that was funded by the Mayor of London's office to try and use sport to reduce knife crime amongst youth. Our role was not to teach those organizations how to deliver an effective program. They already knew how to do that. What our role was to design a different kind of monitoring and evaluation program, to develop a different kind of evidence, which is what we do a lot of with Football for Peace now, is work with the organizations to create the kind of evidence that will demonstrate the beginnings of social change. Because most organizations already know how to create the evidence that they're delivering an effective program.
Deixa eu corrigir um erro aqui. A pergunta anterior foi feita pela Vitória Soto. Desculpa, Vitória, não tinha lido o seu nome. Tem uma última pergunta aqui da Jéssica Rodrigues, que é: algumas pessoas no mundo já estão tentando medir o SROI, o retorno do investimento social, colocando valores ou evidências em habilidades sociais ou comportamentos sociais. Você acha que esse é um caminho para medir as evidências e contribuir para essa afirmação de que o esporte tem o poder de mudar o mundo?
If I had a clear and easy answer to that question, I would probably be working for the United Nations. There are a couple of assumptions in the way that question is phrased, and that is not a criticism of the individual that asked it, but one of the frames in which sport for development and sport for social change is often spoken about. The idea of investment is an economic term. And if you're going to measure something, it means you're trying to quantify something. You're trying to create a statistic. But when we listen to the stories of what sport does for people, right? We don't hear people say, oh, I'm 80% happier now because I played sport. Actually, that's incorrect. We do see that. That comes out in the outcomes of programs, where 90% of the young people in a program report that they have increased confidence. Or the young people feel 70% more confident in their abilities. The challenge with that particular approach is, how do you measure the base level of confidence to start with so that you have a 70% increase? So it comes down to the question of what you mean by change. Because the vast majority of the kinds of change that we're talking about have to do with the quality of change, not how much. More?
Obrigada. Tem uma última pergunta para encerrar. Não está identificada, mas a pergunta é a seguinte: Se esportes têm a possibilidade de promover mudanças sociais em pequenas comunidades, se isso é repetido muitas vezes em muitas localidades, isso não teria o potencial de promover a mudança social em uma escala maior?
The short answer is yes. And increasingly, well, I have no evidence to back up this answer. So this is an impression, an idea. The importance of stories cannot be denied. Stories are central to what makes us human. Many of those stories we are taught as children, and we don't question them. In recent years, in a number of countries, we see politicians who consistently tell stories, even though the evidence and the facts do not support those stories. This is a polite way of saying that Trump lies, and Putin lies, and Keir Starmer lies, and whomever else, right? They're not interested in what is accurate. They know as long as they keep repeating the same story, people will begin to believe it. There is no reason we can't do the same thing with sport, even if we don't have the evidence. But we can also, that is very easy to disprove then if we don't have the evidence. But the last thing I would say about that and stories is the stories are what motivate you to become athletes, to become coaches. And the thing to realize is that the most powerful people in this room are sports coaches. Because you are the people who are teaching and embodying the values for the children who are learning that sport. Not the technical skills, but how to train and how to play the game. Not by what you tell them, but by your own behavior. In the sports club and in the streets, in the community. The kids watch all the time, and they learn from you. You are the most powerful people for creating change. Mas?
Muito bem. Bom, feitas as perguntas, Thomas, a gente gostaria de saber se você tem alguma consideração final para a gente fechar essa etapa, e se tiver essas considerações, para a gente fazê-las em 5 minutos, por favor.
I would just like to reinforce that I am being very critical of sport and that I'm being very critical of what we are told sport can do. That does not mean that what all of you do is wrong or bad. All of you have impact on people's lives, particularly sports coaches. The question is not that you have impact. The question is, what kind of impact are you having? And what is the evidence for that impact?
Muito obrigada, Thomas. Com isso, encerramos este momento da manhã e vamos para o almoço. Mais uma vez, uma salva de palmas para o Thomas. Nossa